Ladies and gentlemen, before we dive into today's remarkable story, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about respect, dignity, and true leadership. Your support helps us keep sharing these powerful messages. Imagine walking into a courtroom and seeing one of Africa's most respected leaders not being questioned about politics or power, but about his character. That's exactly what happened when Captain Ibrahim Traoré entered the courtroom of Judge Fatou Bensouda last month. The young leader stood quietly as Judge Bensouda, known for her sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to justice, looked down from the bench and said, "Captain Traoré, I have been following your career and your public statements for years. There is something I need to challenge you on." The entire courtroom fell into a heavy silence. No one expected what would happen next. Within minutes, every person present, including the usually stern Judge Bensouda herself, would be left speechless. Some even with tears in their eyes after hearing Traoré's powerful response. This isn't just another political discussion or a media spectacle. This is a story about respect, dignity, and a moment of truth that reminds us all of what truly matters in life. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't in court that day facing any charges or controversies. Instead, he had been invited to participate in a special community outreach program organized by the judicial system, aimed at inspiring youth who had faced hardships and brushes with the law. Judge Fatou Bensouda, a respected jurist with decades of experience in international justice, was hosting a series of dialogues with influential figures to give troubled youth a second chance and fresh perspectives. At 64, Bensouda had witnessed everything, from minor infractions to the heart-wrenching failures of justice that can derail young lives. Despite her firm exterior, she held a deep belief in the power of mentorship and rehabilitation. That morning, the courtroom was filled with a carefully selected group of young people aged 15 to 21, many of whom had struggled against poverty, conflict, or social challenges. Accompanying them were their parents, social workers, and a few community leaders. The courtroom, with its towering wooden panels and a proud display of the national flag, radiated an atmosphere of solemn respect. Ibrahim Traoré, now in his mid-30s but carrying himself with the same sense of duty and humility that had made him a beacon of hope for his nation, had agreed to speak about leadership, resilience, and making the right choices in life. Having grown up in modest circumstances himself, Traoré often spoke openly about how easily his life could have taken a darker path without the guidance of mentors and his deep-rooted values. As Traoré approached the podium in the center of the courtroom, Judge Bensouda watched him closely. She had prepared carefully for this moment. Unlike previous guests, she wasn't going to allow this to be just another well-meaning speech. She wanted something genuine, something that would truly impact these young lives. "Captain Traoré," Judge Bensouda began, her voice carrying firmly across the silent courtroom, "thank you for being here today. But before you address our young people, I would like to challenge something I've observed over the years." Traoré looked slightly surprised but nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor. You have been in the public eye for years now. You have led a nation, stood at the forefront of change, and inspired millions. Yet you constantly speak of humility, service, and putting others first. In a world where leaders often showcase their power and achievements, you seem to downplay yours. Some might call it false modesty," Judge Bensouda continued, her voice unwavering. "So here is my challenge to you. Is it all just an act, a carefully constructed image to maintain your popularity? Or do you truly live by these principles when no cameras are watching?" The question lingered heavily in the air. The young people in the courtroom shifted uneasily in their seats. Some of the parents looked visibly surprised that the judge would speak so directly to someone of Captain Traoré's stature. But Judge Bensouda had seen too many young lives enticed by power, fame, and superficial success. She was determined to deliver something real to these youths. Traoré stood at the podium, his hands resting lightly on each side. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he took a deep breath. The silence deepened as he considered Judge Bensouda's piercing question. The young people were riveted, their curiosity palpable. Would he become defensive? Would he hide behind charm and eloquence? Or would he reveal something genuine? "That's a fair question," Your Honor, Traoré finally replied, his voice calm yet reflective. And these young people deserve nothing less than an honest answer. He paused, letting his eyes wander across the room, meeting the guarded stares of the teenagers, many of whom had already seen more hardship than most adults. When I was about your age, Traoré continued, turning his full attention to the young people, I was a boy in the village, lost and restless. My studies were failing. I spent my days idling, falling in with the wrong crowd. Many of the boys I ran with. Some ended up in prison. Some didn't make it at all. He paused again, the weight of his words sinking into the heavy stillness of the courtroom. One afternoon, Traoré went on, an old teacher from our village school saw me loitering by the market. She called me over and said, "Young man, you may not see it yet, but you are meant to lead. You are meant to protect others." I laughed at her then. I didn't believe a word of it, but she saw something in me that I couldn't yet see in myself. Judge Bensouda listened carefully, her stern expression unchanged, but there was a subtle attentiveness in her gaze that showed she was absorbing every word. "But here's where your question cuts deep, Your Honor," Traoré continued, his voice firm. "Success, authority, respect, these things can become dangerous. They whisper to you that you are different, better than others. The real struggle isn't reaching the top, it's staying true to who you are when everyone around you tells you that you are untouchable." Leaving the podium, Traoré walked closer to the audience, his tone becoming more intimate. "Let me share something from the early days of my military career. After my first promotion, I thought I was important. One evening I walked into a small cafe with my uniform, expecting admiration. But no one recognized me. They sat me by the kitchen. I was furious. I thought, don't they know who I am? Some of the teenagers nodded slightly, understanding that burning desire for recognition and respect. On my way home, still angry, I complained to my mentor. He listened quietly and then asked me, "Did you thank the server?" I hadn't. I was so caught up in myself that I had forgotten the simplest courtesy. That night, Traoré continued, I went back to that cafe. I thanked the server, apologized, and left a generous tip. It was a humbling experience, and it taught me that the titles, the uniforms, the applause, they mean nothing if you lose your humility. Judge Bensouda leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady. That's a powerful story, Captain Traoré, but it doesn't fully address my challenge. One isolated act of humility does not prove a consistent character. The teenagers in the courtroom looked back and forth between the judge and Traoré, watching the unexpected confrontation unfold. You're absolutely right, Your Honor, Traoré acknowledged calmly, and that is exactly the struggle. It's not about one moment of humility, it's about battling pride and entitlement every single day. He paused before continuing, sharing a more difficult and personal story. A few years ago, during a military exercise under extreme pressure, a young officer new to the unit made a mistake that cost us valuable time and nearly compromised the mission. In front of everyone, I lost my temper. I humiliated him in front of his peers. He was only trying his best, but I allowed my frustration to get the better of me. The courtroom was utterly silent now, the weight of his confession hanging heavily in the air. That night, I couldn't sleep, Traoré continued. I realized I had become the very kind of leader I had sworn never to be, someone who uses rank to belittle others. The next morning, before the entire unit, I apologized to that young man. Publicly. Was it easy? No, my pride screamed at me to maintain the image of the infallible commander. But what example would I set if I couldn't admit when I was wrong? Judge Bensouda's expression softened, but she remained firm. These are still just stories, Captain Traoré. How do we know? How do these young people know that you live by these principles consistently? Traoré nodded, accepting the challenge. You don't, he said simply. And that's the truth. I fail every day. I wrestle with ego and pride just like any other man. The question isn't whether I am perfectly humble. I am not. The real question is, what direction am I moving in? Am I striving to be a better man today than I was yesterday? At the back of the room, one of the teenagers raised his hand hesitantly. Breaking protocol slightly, Judge Bensouda nodded to him. But you're Captain Traoré, the young man said, his voice almost disbelieving. You've already made it. Why do you even care about being humble when you have everything? Traoré looked directly at the young man. Because having everything means nothing if you lose yourself along the way, he said. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. Some of the unhappiest people I have met, people with power, status, even great wealth, have lost the things money and titles can never buy: their character, their relationships, their peace of mind. Another young person spoke up, more boldly this time. So you're saying money doesn't matter? The skepticism in the room was almost tangible. No, Traoré replied. Money matters. Resources matter. I have lived with little, and I have lived with much, and I will not lie to you. Having enough is better than struggling. But money is not magic. It does not change who you are. It magnifies who you already are. If you are selfish when you have little, you will be even more selfish when you have plenty. If you are generous with little, you will be generous with much. Judge Bensouda interjected, her voice firm but thoughtful. Captain Traoré, these young people face real challenges: poverty, broken homes, barriers built into the very systems around them. How does your philosophy of humility help them with these very real obstacles? Traoré took a deep breath, understanding the gravity of the question. It doesn't solve them overnight, Your Honor, he admitted honestly. I would never claim that it does, Traoré continued. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. But here's what I do know. How you respond to those challenges will define you more than the challenges themselves. He turned back to the young people, his voice growing more personal. When I first began my military career, he said, there were paths closed to me because of where I came from, so I'm a small village, a modest family. I wasn't from a wealthy background, didn't have powerful connections. Was it fair? No. Did I have every right to be angry? Absolutely. He paused, letting the words sink in. But I had a choice. I could let that anger consume me, or I could use it as fuel, to work harder, to prove that change can come from within the system, not just from outside protest. That choice shaped my life. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. What had begun as a challenge was now turning into a deeply personal exchange about integrity, perseverance, and staying authentic despite adversity and success. Judge Bensouda had been watching Traoré intently. Her critical expression hadn't disappeared completely, but there was a noticeable change. The sincerity in Traoré's words was difficult to dismiss. Captain Traoré, she said finally, you speak well about these principles, but talk is easy. What proof can you offer these young people that your actions match your words? It was a pivotal moment. The entire courtroom leaned in, waiting for his response. Traoré began slowly. Your Honor, I am usually hesitant to speak of such things. Doing good deeds for the sake of recognition defeats their purpose. But for the sake of these young people, I will share something. He turned again to the youth, his gaze steady. For the past 10 years, I have quietly supported a foundation that provides education scholarships to youth from rural communities. Not just paying for school, but offering mentorship, apprenticeships, and life skills training. Over 200 young people have passed through the program. Many of them are now teachers, doctors, engineers, and entrepreneurs, contributing back to their communities. Before Judge Bensouda could respond, an elderly gentleman in the back of the courtroom stood up. The court bailiff instinctively moved toward him, but Judge Bensouda raised her hand, allowing the man to speak. Your Honor, if I may, the man said, his voice slightly trembling with age but rich with dignity. My name is Seydou Konaté. I have been a groundskeeper at Yurgu Secondary School for more than 30 years. Traoré turned, momentarily surprised, and then his face broke into a warm smile of recognition. Captain Traoré may not remember me, Mr. Konaté continued, but about 8 years ago, he visited our school to speak with the students. After everyone had left, he stayed behind. Instead of walking past me like most visitors, he stopped, introduced himself, and asked about my life. The courtroom was silent as Konaté spoke. I told him about my grandson, Mamadou, a bright boy who had gotten involved with the wrong crowd. Captain Traoré asked for my contact information. A week later, someone from his foundation called. They got Mamadou into a special program, helped him catch up on his studies, and eventually guided him to university. Mr. Konate's voice cracked with emotion. Today, Mamadou is in his third year of medical school. Captain Traoré never publicized it, never sought recognition. In fact, this might be the first time he's hearing how it all turned out. Traoré looked genuinely moved, slightly embarrassed by the unexpected recognition. At that moment, a middle-aged woman in professional attire stood up. "Your Honor," the woman in professional attire said softly, "I'd like to add something as well. I work with the Veterans Support Bureau here in Ouagadougou. What many people don't know is that Captain Traoré has been quietly visiting our clinics and support centers for years, without media, without announcements. He sits with veterans, listens to their stories, and has personally contributed to rehabilitation programs for those suffering from trauma and post-conflict stress. He doesn't do it for recognition. He does it because he understands what it means to serve and to suffer." Judge Bensouda's composed expression was beginning to soften, her stern judicial facade cracking just slightly as more voices filled the courtroom. A young man in his 20s stood up next, his voice clear and steady. "I was one of the first students to receive a scholarship from Captain Traoré's foundation," he said. "What he didn't mention is that he personally meets with us twice a year. He knows our names, asks about our families, and follows our progress. This isn't charity for show. He genuinely cares about us." Captain Traoré looked increasingly uncomfortable under the growing praise, which only further highlighted the authenticity of his actions. The humility he spoke of was clearly lived. Then slowly, an elderly woman in traditional dress rose from her seat in the back. "Your Honor," she said, her voice warm but weathered with time, "I worked as a cook at a roadside food stall for over 35 years. About 5 years ago, Captain Traoré came in alone. No entourage, no security. He sat at the wooden bench, ordered 2 and sauce, and chatted with everyone like he was just another traveler. Before he left, he paid not only for his meal, but for every customer who had eaten that day. But what truly touched me was the note he left with the cash. It said, 'Thank you for your smile. You reminded me of home.' He had no idea I was about to be evicted because I couldn't pay for my medicine and rent. That money helped me stay in my home. He never mentioned it again." This is probably the first time he's hearing the outcome. By now, Judge Bensouda's eyes shimmered, though her judicial posture remained intact. The young people in the courtroom leaned forward, completely absorbed, many of them seeing, perhaps for the first time, what true character looked like. Captain Traoré finally spoke, his voice humble. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I'm deeply moved by what has been shared here today. But I am also uncomfortable. For every story like these, there are many moments where I have failed to live up to my own values. I am not here as someone who has it all figured out. I am here as someone who is still learning, still growing, still striving to do better." Then something unusual happened, something rarely seen in that courtroom. Judge Bensouda stood from her bench, her voice solemn but sincere. "Captain Traoré," she said, "when I challenged you today, I expected defensiveness, or at best, a well-rehearsed speech about humility. What I have seen instead is something far more valuable for these young people to witness: authentic character. Character that has been tested and proven, not by your words, but by the impact you have had on others." She let the silence settle before continuing. "This court recognizes that true leadership is not forged in the spotlight, but in the quiet places where no one is watching. Captain Traoré, I withdraw my challenge, and instead I thank you. Not just for your services to the nation, but for showing what it truly means to succeed, not only in rank, but in humanity." What happened next left the entire courtroom breathless. Captain Traoré stepped forward and asked with humility, "Your Honor, may I say one final word to these young people?" Visibly moved by the heartfelt testimonies, Judge Bensouda gave a slight nod. Traoré turned to face the youth gathered in the courtroom, his eyes full of purpose. "I want to speak directly to you now," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "Everything you have heard today, my achievements, my mistakes, none of it matters if you don't understand one essential truth. Your life is not defined by what you accomplish," Captain Traoré said, his voice steady, "but by what you choose to stand for. He paused, making eye contact with several of the teenagers seated in the front rows. Each of you here today has a choice to make, not just once, but 1,000 times, every single day. Will you choose integrity when no one is watching? Will you choose to lift others up instead of tearing them down? Will you choose to keep going when everything seems against you? There was a rare vulnerability in Traoré's expression, one not often seen in military leaders. When I was your age, I was lost, completely lost, he admitted. My father was a school teacher, a man of faith, discipline, and conviction. But I didn't want to follow his path. I was restless, angry, rebellious. I thought those values, honesty, discipline, service, were chains. It took me years to realize that those values weren't limiting me. They were the foundation of real strength, of real freedom. Judge Bensouda, still standing beside the bench, listened silently, her arms no longer crossed, her expression now openly moved. There was a day, Traoré continued, when I was about 20. I was sitting outside my mother's kitchen hut, reading. I came across a line in a small old book someone had given me. It said, "The two most important days in your life are the day you are born and the day you discover why." That question changed my life. Why am I here? The young people leaned in closer, hanging on his every word. "Let me tell you this," he said, sweeping his hand across the room. "Your past, your struggles, your mistakes, your hardships, they don't define your future. What does define it is this: are you willing to take responsibility for your life? Are you willing to serve something greater than yourself?" He gestured gently toward the people who had stood up to share their stories. "You heard these testimonies. But the truth is, any good I've managed to do in this world isn't because I'm special. It's because I finally understood that my life isn't just about me. Real success isn't in medals, speeches, or ranks. It's about using whatever platform you have, whether you're a farmer, a teacher, a soldier, or a student, to make life better for the people around you." He walked closer to the first row, his gaze firm but encouraging. Some of you might be thinking, that's easy for him to say. He's Captain Traoré. But remember where I began. I was a boy from Kaya who could have just as easily ended up in prison or dead. The difference wasn't luck. It wasn't talent. It was the choices I made, and the people around me who expected better from me, sometimes more than I expected from myself. He turned and looked toward Judge Bensouda. "Like this, Judge," he said with a faint smile. "She didn't let me off easy today. She challenged me. She pushed me. She demanded substance. Not just words. That's what real respect looks like. Holding others to a high standard because you believe they can meet it." Then, in a deeply personal gesture, Traoré reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of old paper. "This," he said, "is something I've carried with me since I was just starting out. It's a list my mother gave me. Simple principles. May I share them with you?" The youth nodded eagerly. Traoré read from the paper. 1. Put God first in everything you do. 2. Fail big. Don't be afraid to take bold chances. 3. Discipline and consistency are the keys to growth. 4. Never forget where you came from, and help others get where they're going. He folded the paper carefully and returned it to his pocket. Simple words, but living by them, he looked at the youth with quiet intensity. That's the hardest and most rewarding work you'll ever do. Judge Bensouda, visibly moved now, stepped closer and addressed the room with a softened voice. "Captain Traoré," Judge Bensouda said softly, her voice carrying the weight of sincerity, "I believe every person in this courtroom today has witnessed something extraordinary. Not just your words, but the ripple effect of the lives you've touched. If you had one final message to leave with these young people, what would it be?" Traoré stood still for a moment, thinking deeply before answering. "Remember this," he said, "hard work works. Working hard at your craft, at your education, at your character, at serving others, it works. Dreams without goals are just dreams. To make them real, you must set clear goals. And to reach them, you must commit to discipline and consistency every single day." He slowly looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each young person. "You will fail," he said calmly. I've failed many times, but the lesson is not to avoid failure. It's to never quit. Life will knock you down, hard. But it's not about how hard you can hit back. It's about how hard you can get hit and still rise again, still keep moving forward. The courtroom was utterly silent. Many of the young people had tears in their eyes. Not from pain, but from the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, they too could write a new chapter. Traoré's voice softened, but somehow became even stronger. And one last thing. At the end of your life, it won't matter how many titles you held, how much money you made, or how popular you became. What will matter is this. Did you make a difference in someone else's life? Did you lift others as you climbed? Did you turn your blessings into blessings for someone else? That, he said, placing a hand over his heart, is the measure of a life well lived. Then something happened that had never occurred in Judge Bensouda's 20 years on the bench. She stepped down from the bench and, with a warm but dignified gesture, extended her hand to Traoré. Captain Traoré, on behalf of this court and these young people, thank you. You came here prepared to give a speech, but you've given us something far more valuable. You've given us a glimpse of what true success looks like. As Traoré took her hand, the entire courtroom rose in spontaneous applause. The young people, many of whom had entered the courtroom with skepticism, guardedness, and even defiance, were now on their feet, their faces transformed by the possibility that perhaps their own lives could take a different turn. In that moment, it wasn't about Captain Traoré, the revolutionary soldier or national figure. It was about the power of authentic character to inspire hope and transformation, even in a courtroom filled with forgotten youth. As the applause echoed through the chamber, Traoré smiled humbly and said, "Remember, this is not about me. It's about you, each of you. From this day forward, you are the author of your own story. Make it one worth telling." And with those words, Judge Fatou Bensouda's courtroom had indeed been left speechless, not by clever rhetoric nor by political showmanship, but by the power of truth spoken with conviction and backed by a life of quiet, unwavering integrity. If you found meaning in this story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing real stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us what truly matters: character, courage, and compassion. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Together, let's spread more messages of hope, integrity, and purpose. Thank you for watching.